Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us again. This is the Best of the West book club, where Dr. Robillard and I are looking at a selection of books that we think is important for addressing some of the neglected concepts in Western education currently. He left Oxford, and I was sacked from Eton over a failure to understand some of the concepts outlined in this series at those two respective places. In other words, the woke takeover of schools and academia. So we're passionate about this. We've looked at Hovell's The Power of the Powerless so far, exploring how totalitarian systems answer to the absence of any kind of spiritual and metaphysically grounded sense of the role of human life, its value, meaning, and purpose. Now we're looking at, in Edward Feser's The Last Superstition, how scientism, a particular philosophical view of the world as distinct from science, fulfills that same function. In other words, it has a totalitarian function. Lesson one, we covered a couple of important concepts. In your mind, Dr. Robillard, what was the most important point from last week?
For me, I think it's what we left off on at the very last point that we made, that Feser ends at the end of his chapter making the distinction between capital B being a necessary being as God. And that's what Aristotle and Aquinas are arguing for, versus lowercase b contingent beings like Thor or Odin or the flying spaghetti monster, etc., that Harris and the four atheists, the four horsemen, set up as the straw man attack on Aquinas and Aristotle's conception of God. So I think that distinction is probably the most crucial and one that is radically neglected when the four horsemen uh, give their account of the cosmological argument and the argument and the other five proofs that Aquinas offers. So I think that's the biggest small error that leads to big errors that Feser points out.
So we're not thinking about a God who starts the universe off somehow and then leaves it alone.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, it's what keeps the universe in existence at every moment.
Mm-hmm.
And what if people are thinking, hold on a minute, what caused God? Why is that a nonsensical objection? What caused God?
It's nonsensical insofar as we're not talking about a linear sequence within time and space of a chain of causal entities. Rather, we're talking about a grounding of being that sustains everything, that sustains all true claims, that holds certain propositions to be true before there were even human minds. So whatever grounds that, whatever holds the truth of those in place, is the entity that these folks are referring to. So that needn't require a contingent cause to explain. It just is necessary. That's just what a necessary being is.
Good. And we'll get back to that with Aristotle later and the idea of the unmoved mover. So the video of chapter one, excuse me, the video of chapter one is available to watch from last time. And before we get into the material for chapter two, let's begin with our normal prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, divine creator, true source of light and fountain of wisdom. Pour forth your brilliance upon my dense intellect. Dissipate the darkness which covers me, that of sin and of ignorance. Grant me a penetrating mind to understand, a retentive memory, method, and ease in learning, the lucidity to comprehend, and abundant grace in expressing myself. Guide the beginning of my work, direct its progress, and bring it to successful completion. This I ask through Jesus Christ, true God and true man, living and reigning with you and the Father forever and ever. Amen. So we'll begin then with this idea of the forms, central to Plato's thought, but one which, at least for most people nowadays, is probably the strangest. the most alien to modern ways of thinking. And we've
Hmm.
selected as the quotation that struck us most in Feser's account of it, that the man who makes out of the cave knows the real nature of things. We discussed the cave a bit in connection with Hubble, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, and it seems like the analogy here would be getting out of the ideological matrix that one happens to be stuck within, and this comes in the form of the greengrocer who refuses to put up the "Workers of the World Unite" sign, and in so doing, he breaks out of the cave and signals to everyone else that he's broken out.
This is a bit different though, because Plato means something else, doesn't he? What is a Platonic form? What does he mean by knowing the real nature of things?
So, as we talked about a bit before, Plato is looking at particulars instantiated within the world and is trying to get to the essence of what these things actually are. So, he witnesses that within the world that he apprehends, he sees a poorly drawn triangle on a piece of paper, and then he sees a really cleanly drawn triangle, and then he notices a physical triangle instantiated within a piece of architecture. And he sees these are all instances of triangles. But he wonders, is there, whatever holds this resemblance that makes them triangles must be in virtue of something beyond just these particular instances of triangle. So he thinks that there's a form that is neither in his head or in the world, but in some sort of third place that is the form of the ideal triangle. And likewise with goodness, for instance, or beauty, or personhood, that there are particular instances of goodness or beauty or personhood in the day-to-day world, in our thoughts, in maybe fictitious or imaginative form. But then there's this realm, this third realm, that where all these things are, they're all participating in the essence or the form of personhood or goodness or beauty. So this is the real world that Plato thinks is people apprehending, rather than the world of particulars that can come and go and can change and are mutable.
So, taking the example of a triangle, then, all really existing triangular objects are somehow imperfect. All material triangles fail to instantiate triangularity perfectly.
Mhm.
And yet, we know they all have triangularity in common. We can abstract from all particular triangles and grasp the concept in pure geometrical form. And Plato's idea then is that triangularity is a universal. This is mind independent, not something that is, as people put it today, a social construct. So let's say that no human beings had ever existed. The nature of a triangle would still be exactly the same. And in fact, it is what it is in all possible worlds.
Mhm.
And we
Yes.
can apply this to other concepts like beauty, for example. Let's say that we have a painting, a piece of music, a poem, even it might be, for example, a particular free throw in basketball. We see beauty
Mhm.
instantiated in many kinds of objects, and it's really there. Beauty is something objective. You mentioned goodness. That's another example, too, isn't it? Objective
Mhm.
goodness as a kind of
Right.
form. Tell us a bit
Mhm.
more about that. What happens if someone is a moral relativist, for example, and they say that, well, during Nazi Germany, what the Nazis thought they were doing to them was good, and morality is just a social construct. There's no really existing good or evil. How's that relevant to Plato's idea of there being a form, there being objective goodness?
Well, I think it comes down to that their use of the term goodness. It's if moral relativism is true, then that's not it's not referring to anything. It's just looping back onto the particular culture, however that's defined.
Mm.
Which ends up running into its own problems. So the even the metaphysical underpinnings of making that claim beyond just goodness don't have much anchoring to them. Culture is always a rough thing to define as well. Um, but yeah, their concept of goodness, if it's indexed back to the culture, isn't really referring to anything. And then these very same folks, though, in the same breath, will say, "Well, therefore you ought to be tolerant, right? I'm a moral relativist, therefore I ought to be tolerant." So they end up smuggling some type of moral claim back through the front door. So any claims to goodness, if we're going to coordinate our concepts and our language, have to be gripping at some minimal level. They need to be gripping or referring to the same thing, and that is what Plato would argue is the form of goodness.
Right. And what's interesting is that something like Plato's theory of forms appears to be necessary to have not only morality objectively or beauty, but even truth itself. Because if you watch
Mm-hmm.
what happens when people dismiss the idea of this, then
Yes.
you hit the reductio ad absurdum relatively quickly.
Yes. Yeah. They end up making claims about truth being relative, which are, of course, propositional claims that require that to be true in order to for it to get off the ground. So yes, the moral relativism bleeds into the epistemological metaphysical relativism quite quickly, and you see, yeah, the whole structure becoming deeply incoherent.
Yeah, precisely. And this is why it's amusing when people, well, not amusing, but tragic when people dismiss metaphysics as airy fairy,
Mm-hmm.
nothing language, because the consequences are perhaps more real than scientific errors in a way.
Oh, certainly. I mean, Feser points us out that science. I mean, it's not brute empiricism. Science requires for science to get off the ground. It requires mathematical universals or universal scientific principles. So underpinning science or appeals to naive empiricism, uh, uh, it requires this background assumption of at least mathematical universals, if not universals of regularity in nature.
Yeah, exactly. So underpinning science, even while many scientists, in the name of science, but actually
Mm.
scientism, will at least claim to reject it.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. This is how logical positivist program ended up failing for this very reason.
Yeah, that's it. And we've addressed this point briefly already, but
Mm.
Feser points out that to accept the results of science is to accept that there are mind independent universals. So, why is this then? What happens if we don't accept the existence of mind independent universals? Let's say numbers, for example. You talked about mathematical realism then.
Mhm.
Numbers don't really exist independent of our minds.
Yeah, that I I can't make heads or tails of that. It seems like if that were the case, then I would be operating the world by my conception of $4 or four eggs or four horseshoes, and you'd be operating by your particular version of four, and everybody else, and it seems like there would be no common ground by which any of these things would be referring to, and it just seems like, yeah, just radical subjectivity at that point. There's no common reference point to anything.
It's important to realize, isn't it, that the human mind can grasp the fact that in no possible universe could 2 plus 2 equal 5.
Hmm.
So
Yep.
our ability to know at least some truths as being true of necessity is
Hmm.
something difficult to make, well, impossible to make sense of on any purely naturalistic account of the mind.
Yep.
People talk
Yep.
about, but evolution, however they use that term, is normally a pretty broad brush just to explain things away. But people talk about how evolution would mean it's likely that your cognitive faculties are at least a roughly reliable guide to your survival. But to
Mhm.
know that it's true of necessity, that in no possible universe could 2 + 2 = 5, you can
Mhm.
survive pretty well without knowing that.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. That is a survival, uh, it's a good thing to know that, I suppose.
And
It's a
there's no
survival
need
mode.
to know that it's true of necessity for all possible universes. We,
Yeah.
we could
Yeah.
just survive well knowing that it's true now in this one.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
And what happens then if we get the philosopher who denies the existence of universals, of Platonic forms? Feser points out that he runs into the difficulty that he cannot so much as defend his own position.
Mhm.
We
Right.
mentioned before about self-contradiction being a touchstone of error, and you pointed out logical positivism a few minutes
Mhm.
ago. What is
Yep.
that, and how did that fall afoul of the same thing?
So logical positivism, I mean, came out really of a lot of the fan club of early Wittgenstein, AJ Ayer, I think who else, Hempel, and some of those other folks. But their main claim was that they wanted to get away from language that had anything to do with any metaphysical claims, and they thought everything could be reduced to just very empirical verification. But Carnap pointed out that claims about verification aren't verifiable. So right away, that's just the death knell of that entire project. So the point being is that you're going to have to get science off the ground. You're going to have to appeal to axioms that are not empirically verifiable, and which means that now we start drifting back towards these metaphysicians that we thought we had matured, the Western civilization had matured away from. But it turns out that the metaphysics, it keeps sneaking back in the back door, as much as we think we want to escape it, or that we have escaped it.
Now, that seems like quite a weird thing for anybody to want to advance as a theory. What was the motivation for logical positivism? We talked a bit about this in lesson one, didn't we? Why did scientism arise? Where does this idea that we can't have metaphysics sneaking in come from?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is human pride, thinking that the apparatus of science has given us this magic tool to, we're making advances in controlling nature, and then it begins overstepping its um, its capacities, and that I think is at least one part of it. Um, in maybe a more immediate sense, you could think that maybe the Wittgenstein, the logical positivists, and the analytics are responding to the excesses of the 19th century idealists who were spinning up these grand, metaphysical pictures of the world, whether it was Hegel or uh, Schelling or Fichte or company like that. So the thought being is that this is just getting way too metaphysically airy fairy. Let's get down. Let's make philosophy scientific. Let's make it just about a rigorous scientific process, and that overcorrected in just the same way, or it became excessive in just the same way.
Thinking about Aristotle's relationship to Plato, though, you could argue that in a sense, is the same kind of corrective. That
Mm.
Aristotle brought Plato's theory of the forms down to earth, which is the idea of hylomorphism, which we'll get
Right.
into in subsequent chapters. But there's
Mm.
nothing really airy-fairy about the concepts in Aristotle we're going to be looking at in today's lesson, is there?
Right, right. Yeah, Aristotle is, I think, yeah, the great um, medium between the high church airy fairy theories of Plato and the forms and good common sense intuition and making those things um, intelligible. And he does it wonderfully. And Feser points out that he had all the theoretical, he had all the right questions that Plato was asking, but then he was also right about his answers to them in ways that Plato wasn't.
Yeah, that's it. So what we're looking at then is that something like Plato's theory of forms is necessary for there to be science at all,
Mm,
even truth at all. It's just what exact style of this are we going to have? And Aristotle has a particular answer to that. If
mm.
you reject it, then it's difficult even to justify your rejection coherently.
Yes, yes, yep, yep.
So, for that reason, Feser, and I don't think this point can be overemphasized, argues that abandoning Aristotelianism was the single greatest mistake ever made in the entire history of Western thought. And we'll talk a bit about what Aristotelianism is exactly, but this idea that one mistake, taking one wrong turn, can
Mm.
have drastic consequences, some of which aren't evident until centuries later. It's a really fascinating one, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, certainly. But it does, I think, make sense when you think about it in other projects and when you look at the arc of Western civilization and where certainly where we're at right now. I mean, if I'm building some grand building and the foundation is just one of the core beams is just a millimeter off, and I start building one floor after the next after the next, by the time I'm at whatever floor 100 and I start noticing it's wobbling and I start making little ad hoc adjustments, but now those adjustments have created a change in the balancing, so I need to readjust again with some other ad hoc adjustments. So now it's correction upon correction ends up being uh, this misshapen unstructural thing that you end up making atop a singular error. So I think that it very much happens in other contexts, and you know now we're at pregnant men. You must say that men can be pregnant, but like that's like we went around. We forgot to carry the one somewhere in our architecture equation.
Yeah,
Gotta go back to the blueprints and figure out where it was. But
yeah, that's a great way to put it. Thinking about
yeah,
the building analogy as well, if you get something wrong in the initial stages, it's likely to collapse at some point. There's only so much tinkering you can do
yes,
because you
yes,
haven't got
yeah,
something that's secure ultimately.
yep,
So the
yep,
metaphysical foundations of a culture broadly, but
yep.
specific cultural enterprises like science, they really
Mhm.
matter.
They really matter, and I mean, furthermore, is that you can get a lot of things done with the rickety building and a lot of like you can build for a while. You can build for a while with these ad hoc adjustments and cover ups and make a lot of progress, so to speak. And you can build a lot of floors without noticing any of the significant errors until you do, and until things go really, really sideways. But it's not that the single error at the beginning is is necessarily perceptible. It might require a lot of building upon that error to include generations who have done so until we actually really notice what the small thing was that was left out in the beginning.
And also the way in which what you're even allowed to investigate is affected as well. So let's
Mm-hmm.
say you start from the assumption that only matter exists. Well, from that point onwards, you're not going to be able to account for mind, for intellect.
Mm-hmm.
It's not
Yeah.
something you find out through discovery. Oh well, I guess that the mind doesn't exist. There's nothing immaterial. You've just decided that from the outset by
Hmm.
decree that only matter
Yeah.
exists. And there
Yes.
doesn't seem to be a good reason for that assumption. If anything, you would, through common sense, assume the opposite.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly one's own phenomenal experience of the world would speak to the opposite. And then if one starts reasoning through things and saying, well, I'm interacting with other persons as if they have other minds. We're looking at the historical and scientific record as if these were other minds. We have a justice system and a notion of ethics and fairness and forgiveness that it assumes other not minds making free decisions. You start realizing, wait, I kind of need this in my ontology to make sense of all these other things.
And for those reasons, we'll come back to this idea that Aristotelianism, no matter how alien some of the concepts might sound to people now, is actually very much a refinement of a commonsensical view of the world. So we
Mm-hmm.
begin with empiricism, we begin with the senses, and then we abstract from the kinds of patterns that we observe, and we end up with universals ultimately. So it's like a pincer movement almost that combines the two elements of empiricism and rationalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I like that.
Now, here's where things get a bit technical. So, crucial concepts in Aristotle's thought are potentiality and actuality. Now, these might seem dry, abstract, dusty academic ideas, but Feser points out interestingly that unless you make these distinctions, you cannot fully understand the abortion and euthanasia
Mm-hmm.
debate. So, Roe versus Wade, for example, is a hot political issue because ultimately underlying it is a really important philosophical principle. And many things are like that, aren't they? Including, for example, the transgender debate.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Preferred pronouns. What's the big deal of just saying the word that somebody else demands that you respect them by saying them by? What's the big deal? Well, turns out a lot of a lot of things can rest on very small, fine grained points, right? I mean, the Challenger disaster occurred because of one small, hasty mathematical mistake with the O rings. So yeah, small errors can lead to rather um, big tragedies.
We'll get on to explaining these two concepts and their relevance to abortion, for example, in a second. But we've got a question, Michael, for you about the building analogy. Isn't any building built by humans going to have errors in it somewhere? Do you think the Aristotelian system is a perfect system or just the best system we've got?
Totally agree with that. Yeah, I think any system we have as in a man-made fallen world is going to be flawed in all sorts of ways that we just can't ever get around. So I don't think it's a perfect system, but I think it is probably the best and most comprehensive system that humans have, uh, that we can build upon, that Aquinas built upon, and that the West has built upon. So uh, flawed, certainly, but I think it's robust and good enough for within a fallen world.
Interestingly, that point is one of the arguments for revelation. We're
Hmm.
both Christian, as are many people watching. Even Plato and Aristotle, arguably the two greatest human minds, certainly in the pagan world, they were justifying population control and abortion.
Hmm.
The Stoic philosophers justified suicide. So the human intellect without revelation is prone to all kinds of mistakes.
Hmm.
And you can even start with all the correct premises and not be able to reason your way from them without making logical errors of various sorts.
Hmm.
So even if
Hmm.
you did have all the perfect premises, given the limitations of the human intellect, we're not saying it's radically imperfect somehow in a way that would
Hmm.
justify fundamental skepticism. But humility is always required.
Right. Hmm.
So, what are these ideas of potentiality and actuality then? What do we mean?
So the pre-Socratics were really trying to get their head around how do we deal with stasis and change, and they all gave their various attempts at trying to say, well, reality is all stasis, or it's all change, or it's water, or it's fire, or it's numbers. Plato said it was the forms, and Aristotle was trying to answer this question as well. And the view on the table, or the popular view at the time, was that there's being and that there's non-being, and Aristotle is trying to make the claim that actually no, there's a different way of looking at just being and non-being. We can look at this idea of potential and actuality. We can look at so Feser gives an example of like a bouncy ball, that it has the actuality at the time of being a ball that bounces and it's rubber, but it has the potential for me to melt it and turn it into some sort of rubbery soup, or it has the potential to be cut in half, or it has the potential to um, be to bounce, even if it's in a static state. So this distinction, and by the way, this the potential of the ball, it's different from that of a piece of spaghetti or yarn, where the potential of the form, it's indexed to the form itself. So it's only the form is sort of this filter by which the certain potential is actualized, and that's what
Right,
makes the thing what it is. So
right,
there's this sort of truncated way in which actuality and potential connect to one another through the form or the substance of what a particular entity is.
right. So we could take a kid's rubber bouncy ball and we could get the beginnings of a wrestling mat for you to do your training on. But
Correct. Yep.
spaghetti, no.
No. No. Not yet. Water. No. Um, ice. No. Um,
The
yeah.
potentiality
Air. No.
isn't there.
Yeah. Correct. Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Now, how do we get from that to the idea that it's somehow relevant to abortion and euthanasia? I think most people will get the rubber bouncy ball point,
Hmm.
but
Yep.
what does this mean as applied to human beings and moral questions like abortion?
Right. So another example we can look at in more in this space of here's the move from the bouncy ball something to persons. So Aristotle has the idea of the acorn and the oak tree. So I have an acorn and it's just an acorn, so to speak, but it has the potential to grow into an entire tree. So like latent within just the acorn is this its full actuality is that of an oak tree, and that's arguably why it would be minimally worse to destroy a acorn than the bouncy ball. But then lexically different from the inert matter to living organisms to personhood is that the zygote is a person, that has the potential to be a fully actualized life, to go through the entire arc of a human life, and to be a kid and an adolescent and a parent and a grandparent, and all of that entire arc and all of its side effects is snuffed out by the single that all of that potentiality is snuffed out by the single act of abortion. And so that's what makes the blocking of that actuality so morally wrong and reprehensible in a way that is markedly less than whatever, ripping up the bouncy ball.
Yeah, and you can find in standard textbooks the canonical position that the fetus is a human being, but without this metaphysical account, you can't fully grasp what the moral significance of that is. So
It's
scientifically, you can
it's
have,
just a ball of cells, right?
yeah,
That's what you end up with instead. Yeah.
yeah, life begins
Yeah.
at conception scientifically, and then Aristotle gives you the answer about why that matters.
Yeah, and why it matters a lot. Why it matters, um, just lexically beyond so many, almost anything. Yeah.
Yeah, although ironically, Aristotle himself, um, like Plato, wasn't opposed to abortive practices. So that comes back to the point that we had earlier about even if you have the correct metaphysical ideas, sometimes you can't actually reason your way through to the correct
Yep.
conclusions properly,
Yep.
which is
Yep.
why we mentioned the necessity of revelation and why
Mm-hmm.
the prayer that we begin these with acknowledges the fact that the human intellect is ultimately darkened by sin.
Mm-hmm.
Question that's come in: is this argued just from philosophy or also metaphysics? Well, metaphysics is ultimately just a branch of philosophy. So I wouldn't make a hard line separation between the two of them. Would you agree?
Yeah, yeah. I would just say that philosophy subsumes metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Usually, that's the breakdown.
Yeah. Asking as a Christian, if goodness, truth, and beauty have essences and are derived from God, where does the essence of evil come from? Are its roots in something created as opposed to God himself? This is a big question that St. Augustine addresses at length, and this will be one of the big topics that we explore when we get to him in the reading list. But basically, you've got the Manichaean heresy, which is that evil is somehow a being which is distinct in itself. So the universe is like a good, very powerful being, God, and then another very powerful evil being, and they are fighting each other. Well, Christianity, to put it very briefly, says that in fact, evil has no real ontological status. It's a privation of good. And that's why Lucifer, the brightest of the angels, was created good. All the things like intellect, for example, beauty, they come as gifts from God. And then when he rebels and goes against his place in the hierarchy of being and wants to be number one through pride, forgetting that his gifts came from God and aren't of his own making, then he becomes Satan. And all those good things instead disappear. And evil is like a shadow. So I would say that to understand this, you can get a torch and shine light from it, but you can't get a darkness torch and just shine out a beam of darkness. A shadow isn't a substance, it's not a thing in itself. So, no, evil, strictly speaking, um, doesn't have an essence in that sense. I don't know if I've explained that clearly enough. You got any thoughts to add to that?
No, I thought that was very succinctly and well put. Yeah, so that evil is fundamentally it's a privation of the good, and not it doesn't have its own essence.
So this is a really big concept and one that you don't actually get in many religions, which tend towards the idea
Mm,
that there's some kind of big cosmic battleground. And that
yep.
to me shows a failure to understand the nature of God that we get in the monotheistic religions. And
Mm,
I don't think it's a coincidence that that vision of the world as being spiritual conflict is something we see in polytheistic religions.
mm, right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I
Obviously,
think that
Christianity
there is.
conflict, but God's all powerful.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a version going back to what we said at the end of chapter one of the difference between being capital B and contingent beings. It's
Yeah,
almost that, like it's the account of evil on those same terms, as evil is just a set of contingent beings or something akin to that.
that's it. People who want to know a bit more about this, there's a good section on it in C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, where he talks about the Manichaean heresy as it's manifested in various pagan religions. All right. Now, this next one, I've got a diagram so you can understand it a bit more clearly, because otherwise, some of the terminology sounds a little bit intimidating. Aristotle has this idea of the four causes: material cause, formal cause, efficient cause, and the final cause. Let's have a look at these in a bit more detail so we can understand what Feser means when he says that there cannot be efficient causes without final ones. I think it's fair to say, Dr. Robillard, that the attempt to rule out final causality is close to being the defining feature of the scientific worldview and of modern culture generally. Would you agree?
Yes, yeah, certainly. I think that's, if you could sum it up in on one issue, it would be that. Yeah, it would be the erasure of final causality from the Western worldview.
So what is final causality then? We've got a heart example here.
Mhm.
Well, the material cause is basically what is the thing made of. In the case of the heart, Feser points out that it's a kind of muscle tissue, cardiac tissue.
Mhm.
You can't have a heart made out of the same matter as your toenail, for example.
Mhm. Yeah.
Then the formal cause is what kind of structure, what kind of arrangement does the heart exhibit? Well, we need atria, we need ventricles, and all the other kinds of things that in a biology test you would label as the parts of the heart.
Mhm. Mhm.
Even if you had cardiac muscle tissue and you arranged it into the shape of an ear, for example, well, you haven't got a heart.
Mhm.
So
Yep.
material cause and formal cause are very closely related.
Mhm.
Now things get more interesting. Remember that we said a moment ago that the denial of final causality is close to being the defining feature of modern philosophy, science, culture generally. I can't remember whether Feser says it actually is or not in chapter two. Can you recall
Mhm.
anything?
Um, I'd have to think, but maybe not explicitly. I don't know how much I know he has that. The disavowal of Aristotelianism was a
Yeah,
single great mistake, but I don't know if he says as much about the just how bad or detrimental the removal of final causality in particular was.
yeah.
Um,
I
yeah.
guess abandoning Aristotelianism basically means abandoning the idea of final causality.
You're right, yeah, because you're going to find material and formal and possibly efficient in other Enlightenment systems of thought.
Yeah,
But you're not going to find final causality in an Aristotelian sense anywhere.
but you should.
Not explicitly, right? Even but
Yeah,
they
yeah,
smuggle it. Yeah.
right. And this is Faser's point that they might try to do without final causality, which is basically what is the thing for. They want to
Hmm.
stop short of that, but
Yeah.
they are interested, particularly people who want to tout evolution as the grand theory of everything that explains everything. They are very interested in the efficient cause. So,
Hmm.
how do we get, once we've got cardiac muscle tissue, and we also know what shape a heart needs to be a heart? How do we actually get a heart? Well, whatever processes, and there's no need to even understand them in detail, whatever gets that tissue to grow into the shape of a heart rather than an ear or a brain or an eye, that's the efficient cause, how it comes into being.
Hmm.
And I think it's probably the idea of evolution as the explain all efficient cause for how human beings came into existence that got
Mhm.
people very excited about the idea that, well, we don't need to have any kind of purpose now.
Right,
It
right.
just happened. This is the process
Mhm.
by which it all came into existence. And then, final cause, we never reach it in theory. There's no purpose to it. It-
Right. Yep. Yeah.
So,
Pretty much.
the heart, it pumps blood. Now, we can apply these four causes to human beings as well.
Mhm.
The efficient cause would be, people in the scientific camp would argue, evolution ultimately,
Yep.
um,
Yep.
blind chance, necessity, natural selection, random mutation, but it's not actually for anything. There's no final cause for a human being, no purpose.
Yep. 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 That's
But
that's the present view, uh, espoused from by most of the scientific and new atheist camp. That will be where they cut things short.
and yet, the efficient causes and the final ones, according to Feser, can't be separated. Can you give us some examples of that and explain why they can't be separated?
So he does a really good takedown of Hume, where the Hume's whole account is that he's trying to explain macro level causality in terms of events. So the event of me throwing the brick at into the glass causes the event of the glass shattering, and now we're off to the races trying to explain, is it a habit of the mind that these two events happen together, and I'm just I'm projecting this causal glue into the world that isn't really there. And Feser thinks that this creates a whole host of centuries of people building errors upon that Humean account of causality having to do with a sequence of events. And what Feser is going to argue is Aristotle has the right idea from the beginning in recognizing that the cause and effect of the brick breaking the window and the window breaking, that these things they're metaphysically in union with one another. So there's no mystery as to where this gap between these two events is occurring. Um, Latent in the brick going through the window is the windows smashing, right? Latent in the effect, um, or latent in the cause is the effect. And
Right.
in a sense, the cause is it's giving some of its attributes to the effect, uh, in order to bring it about. If the brick didn't have its braking capacity within its weight and its speed, then the window wouldn't break. So the point being is that causes can't bring about effects that aren't somehow potential within what they are.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Hence, Feser points out a cause cannot give to its effect that which it does not have to give.
Hmm.
So, a brick, for example, is able to smash a window by its nature of being a brick. It has the
Yep.
ability to do that. Now, this becomes interesting when you think about evolution in particular. And Feser argues that evolution offers no kind of counter argument to this principle. So let's think why that is in a bit more detail. The brick and the window example, I think, helps people to grasp the idea that somehow latent within the brick is the potential to smash windows. Bricks can do that. But doesn't evolution show that things can just happen and we don't need this idea of the effect being latent in the cause? Fraser argues no.
Yeah, this is Father Ripperger, who you interviewed, points to a very similar issue here, where it turns out that we have to ask ourselves, could just a bundle of accidents in and of themselves as what they are, cause a new kind to emerge, which is ostensibly the claim of evolution. That mere accidents, uh, in and of their nature, uh, over enough time, generate a new kind or a new species, and that would, on the Aristotelian view, violate um, this cause and effect principle, because accidents in and of themselves don't rise to the level of being kinds or species. So that's the Ripperger angle that you can find out there, and I imagine Feser's getting at something similar.
So, in other words, then, the lower life forms that, according to Darwin, evolved into the higher ones have the potential in terms of genetic information, etc., to give to the subsequent ones.
Mhm.
It's, in other words, the same kind of principle in action.
Yeah, yeah, we would somehow be gaining genetic information from lesser um, organized genetic information.
Right.
That seems to be what would be entailed, but that seems, as Kaiser notes, that goes contrary to the second law of thermodynamics, and so that's definitely a problem that Harris and the hardline evolutionists are going to have to deal to explain, rather than just like handle like complexity, like magic words, complexity, and that just solves everything. Well, what's complexity? What's emergence? There need to be something more. Um, what's actually doing the explanatory heavy lifting once we get rid of those words.
Right. In other words, order comes from order. Ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
even in
Right.
evolutionary,
Yeah.
order comes from
Yeah.
order.
Yeah.
A good
Yeah.
question has come in. Isn't the modern view that humans do have final causes, but it's up to each individual to choose his own final cause? Why does the final cause have to be objectively the same for everyone? So I'll just repeat that. Actually, modern culture doesn't deny final causality. It just says that you get to choose your own final
Mhm.
causality.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is we've talked about this at length before. This is the big distinction between the traditionalists and the Enlightenment liberals, between Aristotle and Locke. Whether or not your nature as a human is rather fixed in virtue of being a human, versus being a tabula rasa and thereby the author of your own identity and your own happiness. And I mean, we're obviously tending and making the argument for the Aristotelian case. But I guess I don't know if one isn't convinced of that. I'm not sure what it would require to convince them otherwise, other than run the experiment. Give it a try, and see what does a society look like with radical pluralism in terms of individual teloses. How well does that fare? And after a while, it seems like it devolves into some kind of disorder.
And let's not forget Feser's point that the efficient causality and final causality go together. Because let's say that tomorrow Dr. Robillard decides that his final causality is to frolic in the fields like a horse and eat grass and not earn a living. Well, he'll find out that he can't choose that. That's not his final causality because he's not that kind of thing. He hasn't got the efficient causality to go with it. He hasn't got the material cause either. He definitely hasn't got the formal cause. So you can't just abstract final causality from the other three causes and consider it in isolation like that. And I
Mhm.
actually think that, I mean, Dr. Robillard has written at length on the philosophical problems underlying transgenderism. This is such a great question because what if tomorrow I decide that I don't want to be a husband and father of 6 anymore. I want to be a woman instead, and that's my final causality. Well, same things come into play. Material cause is a problem. I can't get pregnant. And then we've also got formal cause. I'm not the right kind of structure for that. And then we've got the efficient cause. Well, I haven't gone through the biological processes to bring about the potential for motherhood. And then final cause, I can't do what women can do ultimately.
Yep.
It's not an
In
option.
addition to, yeah, yeah, and then in addition to laws of logic also impeding your capacity to even think or conceptualize in a coherent way with these terms referring to anything. So that's like a yet another constraint.
Yeah, exactly it. So what we see then, and there's a real funny side to this, I think. And one of Feser's other books that I'd recommend is Aristotle's Revenge, when he talks
Mm.
about how the attempt to deny any kind of admission to final causality has ironically led to its quite vicious reemergence. So many of you will remember from biology lessons at school being told what various body parts are for, what they do, what their purpose is, their function. Like, what are your eyes for? Well, they help you to see. What are your ears for? You hear. What's your brain for? Your heart for? So even from within the very discipline that is often most hardline about denying any kind of purpose, you get all these appeals to final causes.
Mhm. Any appeal to function that you hear within biomedical science or like ecological environmental science is going to be smuggling in final causality. Even appeals to, yeah, ecological systems. If you listen closely enough, you can hear tinges of, whether something being a biological system has elements of telos in it as well. So yeah, you find teleological or final causality language laden throughout the entirety of the biological sciences, at
And,
least.
yeah, and beyond just the biological sciences too. Let's think about the field of ethics, for example. Imagine that without any kind of reference to final causality.
Hmm.
So we get
Well,
incoherence coming in, don't we, unless we talk like this.
you get infinite trolley problem battles with no resolution to it, which is where we're presently at. Or you get something like legal positivism, where we just speak our legal norms into existence, and then that somehow makes them so, or gives them normativity by the spoken word, which that needs further explanation.
Yeah. And next week we'll be looking at chapter 3. So everybody make sure you read that over the coming week. Exploring how Aquinas in particular developed some of these Platonic and Aristotelian ideas into his arguments for God. Aquinas is in many ways the synthesis of the two thinkers, plus some specifically Christian content as well.
Hmm.
Right?
Yes, and the backbone of the West, it seems like,
Yeah.
or one of the main features of the backbone.
Thanks so much for explaining things so clearly for us, Dr. O'Blood. Always appreciated. Any last questions, guys, before we go? If not, looking forward to answering more questions next week. Chapter 3 is the reading material. All right. Good to see you all. Take care. Have a great week. God bless.
Take it. But
Bye.